It's for
The story is not only bigger than we think, it's also longer than we think. That net, that pull, that stirring could be leading you to an unimaginable future that you can't see. The best place to find courage with what we have to face is to look behind us at God's faithfulness. The passing of time doesn't stop miracles from happening. It makes room for them. God is not aligned with our circumstances. God is with us. With the hope of resurrection, we can live our life with purpose. However long your life is the gift that God has given us. The way we live is our gift back to God. But that's not the end of our story. I guess I have to copy this night. Laurie Shorts, and it's great to be here. And we're going to be talking about my new book. I actually have written 4 other books, and one of them is a Bethany book, 40 Verses to Ignite Your Faith. And this is a little bit of a follow-up to that book, which what I did in that book was explore the lesser known verses in scripture that you don't really hear about when you hear things in church, or when you're looking in your Bible, or the stories we all know. And so what I do in this book is I explore the parts of people's stories in the Bible that are kind of the lesser known parts of their stories that I think give us some big insights about faith. And the way I open the book is I say, faith is defined in the Bible as being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. So it's what's hard about faith is when the things you do see seem to contradict your belief. And I think we can all agree that that faith is a mystery in some way or another, that there are times when it feels like God isn't really there, or is absent, or doesn't care, or maybe you've been waiting for something for a long time, or your life isn't going the way you wish it was, or there's just so many times in life where we either want to give up our faith, or we just don't think there is a God, really. And I know that in my own life, I have experienced that, where I've gone through a season where it just seemed like I was on my own, and I knew that God was with me, but I didn't feel like God was with me based on my circumstances. So this book is an exploration of a lot of people in the Bible who felt the same way. And what I found is a lot of insights about how to lean in and live a life where you're kind of living your way into knowing instead of knowing your way into living. Because I think so often the path that you are on, you don't really even see what's happening until you look back. I don't know if you've experienced that, but I think a lot of life is that way, where we just, you're in a story that you think is one way, and it ends up being something else altogether. And so what I do is I give 10 different insights about faith. And what I thought tonight I would do is read through the insights. And then I also have some quotes in the book, and maybe just be thinking about these quotes. And if there's one that resonates with you, or you want to hear more about, then we'll maybe discuss those quotes, because this is going to be kind of more of a conversation than me giving a talk. I'm actually going to be speaking at Forest Hills Presbyterian Church. Yes. tomorrow for women at 10 o'clock, and then in the church service on Sunday. So that's when I'll give more of a talk, but I thought since it's a little bit of a smaller group that we could just have a discussion about faith. And so anyway, I will, maybe should we start with the quotes? Let's start with some of the quotes that are in the book. So this one, I can't see. This one is kind of the theme of the whole book, which is faith is responding to what is in front of you and then trusting God's purpose for what it will be. And so just briefly explanation about that. Sorry, that's okay. I think sometimes we don't really know, like I'll give you an example in my life. I had broken an engagement. Maybe some of you know that I was single for a really, really long time, longer than I wanted. I ended up finally getting engaged when I was 42 and being super excited, and had my bridal showers and got my wedding dress and had, all these shower gifts, and we had furniture in the home that we were going to live in. And then just about 2 months short of my wedding, my fiance got deployed. He was a Marine Corps reservist, so he got deployed, and he was going to be gone 9 months. And so we decided, well, I've waited this long, so we can wait a little bit longer. And when he left, in the course of his deployment, unbeknownst to me, his ex-wife, who had left him, had second thoughts about their marriage. So when he came back from being gone 9 months, now I've been engaged a year and a half, we actually broke up, and he remarried his ex-wife, and which I always say is a great story when you're not the girl engaged to the guy. And so this was not like my plan for my life at all. And I was a person of faith. In fact, more than that, I wasn't just the person that went to church. I was the person that got brought in for conferences to speak and bring hope. And I was feeling in my own life, where are you, God? And so it was 4 months after that I'm sitting in my apartment, and I get a call from an old friend out of blue. And he says, hey, we were in college. I heard you got married. And I'm like, no. And he goes, well, actually, that's not why I'm calling. I planted this church in Santa Barbara, and we are looking for a specific role on the staff. And when we were praying about it, your name came up. So I was like, gosh, I wasn't looking for a job, but I was looking for a life. So I don't know if you've ever been in that crossroads where, what you want isn't happening, but then something else happens that seems kind of random, but it's actually, and this is kind of what this is, it's what's in front of you. It's the door that's opening. It's not the door that you want, but it's the door that's opening. And what I've discovered in faith and with God is that sometimes the door that opens, that God has for you, might not be the door you want, but you should pay attention to it, because sometimes that door leads to another door, which leads to another door, and it ends up being the door you're looking for, but it's just a different route. And I find that that's so often how God works. And so to respond to what was in front of me was to say, okay, this isn't what I was looking for, but I'm going to go up there because the timing was too weird. So I went up to Santa Barbara, fell in love with the church, ended up moving. And just before I left, of course, everybody told me there were no single people in Santa Barbara. It was like, it's the home of the newlywed and nearly dead. Nobody's single, and actually having been there for now 15 years, I think, that's kind of true. There aren't that many single people in Santa Barbara. So, here I am going to this place, but it was so interesting for me to look back on that decision, that supposed random decision that happened at that time, changed my life in every way. And if I hadn't gone, I never would have met the man that I fell in love with and got married much later than I wanted to. But my whole life was waiting for me, I guess is what I'd say, from responding to what's in front of you and just trusting that you're on this path that might look weird and scary and dark, and you have no idea what's happening, but then all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, all of this led to that. And so, for instance, in the book, what I talk about is some people in the Bible that went through that same thing, like Joseph. I don't know if you guys have heard of Joseph, but I mean, obviously you've heard of Mary and Joseph, but Joseph of the Old Testament, you know, the Technicolor Dreamcoat is the Broadway show, but the one that had the robe. He had a journey, and his story takes up 10 chapters in Genesis that was crazy. I mean, he was sold into slavery. First, he had a dream of greatness, and he was sold into slavery. Then he ended up in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And then prison was what actually led him to the greatness of the palace. So following his story, you're aware that he went through a lot of the stuff that we go through, and you never would have guessed what was going to happen next. And so I just think that sometimes faith is responding just to that, what's in front of you, and then trusting what God's going to do with that decision. So that's what this quote means. And then the next one is, never underestimate what God can do through circumstances you never would have guessed. How many of, does anybody, I mean, does anybody resonate with that quote? Right. Yes, I would think you would. But so tell me about, like, how do you resonate with that? Like, what is that?
Well, I call them God things.
Yes.
And if you look for the God things, you find God things in everything, all day, every day. But you do have to be receptive to them. And yeah, that resonates. It totally resonates, because it does when those times where you make a turn, and the turn is you know, like I said, it's off the beaten path.
Yes.
But it's
Where am I going?
But then you get to wherever it is that you landed, and yeah. So reflecting back and saying that's a God thing, and looking for that is very peaceful.
Yes.
It brings great peace to the, you know, oftentimes, you know,
Yes.
hard times.
Yes. And for those of you who are watching online, what he was saying is that he calls them the God things, you know, and that sometimes you end up after one part of the path going, what is happening? I have no idea where this is leading. And then the next part of the path makes you go, oh my gosh, this was all part of the plan that I just had no idea. Right. Is that a fair way?
That's right.
So in my own life, this quote really resonates with me in so many different ways. I could say so many stories, but I want to save some for tomorrow and the next day that I'm already telling. But one story that this is definitely, as I look back on my life. So I ended up getting married to a man named Jerry. He might be watching right now. And he had a son named Jordan, and I helped raise him, and because his mom moved to Australia, and so being a stepmom, but I raised him with Jerry. And Jerry also had two stepson and a stepdaughter. And those kids, actually his wife had been married before, so he was a stepdad and a bio dad. And when we got married, his stepson was in the wedding. He was excited and everything, but his stepdaughter was not there. And they sort of had a break in their relationship because she was so upset when, you know, her mom before they got divorced. So she wasn't speaking to him. She didn't come to our wedding. And it was something where we just prayed for her. And I end up a year after we get married speaking. And I knew I was speaking at the college that she had attended, but we knew she wasn't there anymore. And so I spoke in chapel, because I did a lot of that, speaking in college chapels. And at the end of chapel, some girls were lined up, and the last one came up to me and said, you know, her name. And it was Jerry's stepdaughter. And I just was like, oh my gosh. So I met her, and I hugged her. I was like, oh, I'm hugging her. I hope that's okay. And we hugged each other. And she later told me the story that she happened to be visiting a friend that she had from going to that college. She happened to be there for like 2 days. And one of the days was when I was speaking in chapel, and her friend was sitting in chapel because she didn't even go, and texted her and said, I think your stepdad's wife is speaking in chapel. So she goes, I have no idea why, but I just felt like I wanted to meet you. So I came. And so what is so crazy about the situation is that through me the one that comes into the picture, actually, that's how Jerry came back together in such a beautiful way with his stepdaughter. And she ended up moving to Santa Barbara, and we, would have breakfast all the time on Saturdays, and she is totally, back with him and him as her dad. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like, you would never, ever in a million years, if you were writing a story, think that would be the way things would happen. But there are so many people in scripture that experience that very same thing. And that's kind of what I talk about it. So it's like the things we experience in life in faith, and then I make the tie to some different stories in scripture that I think show that they went through the same stuff we did, even though you might not hear about it in church all the time, because we always hear the big heroic part of the Red Sea stories. They actually went through a lot of the same frustrations and crazy things that we go through in faith. So that's this one. Here's another one. When God seems too slow, he might be making room for something bigger than we wanted. Does anybody resonate with that one at all? Yeah, for me, I think this quote comes out of some stories that are in here, but it's kind of this open-handedness of what God is actually doing in your life. When, like, I think about, the engagement that broke up, and then the wedding that ended up happening, and the fact that I ended up becoming a stepmom, and then I ended up writing a book about step parenting, and now I'm in touch with all these step parents and kind of have a ministry. That's a sort of side of my ministry that I never would have chosen, but that God had something much bigger in mind than just bringing me the right guy. He had a lot of other people in mind when he brought us together. And I think that's true about so much in our life, that when he's doing something, it's not just for you. It's for people around you that are going to be touched by your story. Like, for instance, pain, when pain happens to us, like for me, being single as long as I was, and not understanding, there's a couple people here that I've been friends with a long time, and so they know that too. I mean, I was like, why is this happening? And maybe it's not being single for you, but all of us go through that, where it's just, I don't understand why this is happening. But what I found is that the pain that we go through actually becomes our biggest connecting point to other people. So, whatever it is that you go through, and so people go through not being able to have a child, or they go through a death, or a cancer diagnosis, or whatever it is that you go through. When you go through something, you find that you now can relate to people who have gone through that very same thing in a very special way. Like the women that got married at 23 and had their 2.5 kids, people who have struggled with long singleness and wanting to find that person probably are not going to go to a person like that, but you're going to go to someone who can relate to you. So that's why it's a strange way. It's like pain is the gift that nobody wants, but it's the thing that actually deepens your soul and what God uses in your life the most. So I think that sometimes when we're waiting for a long time, or we're not getting things exactly the way we wanted them to happen, it's usually this, that he's making room for something bigger that has to do with him. So that's that quote. We judge what will happen based on what is happening, but that's not necessarily what unfolds. So this is about the surprises that, like I talked about Joseph in the Bible, how it was actually his 2-year prison sentence that set him up for the greatness that was happening. But he didn't know that at the time he was in prison. And I think sometimes when we read stories and we see all these incredible things that happen to people, we forget that when they were living those stories, they didn't know what was going to happen. And so what I found is that sometimes we look at our situation and we go, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's ever going to change. It's always going to be like this. And you might be this close to everything changing, but you just don't know it. And that's where we live, is in the unknown. That's what faith is. but to realize, don't judge what will happen based on what is happening. I think that's what causes people to have such defeat. It's always going to be this way. It's never going to change. You know, all I see is this. Well, God works beyond what you see. He might be doing something that you can't imagine, and you are right where you are for a reason, because it's just about to happen. So, does anyone else resonate with this quote? Don't have any comments. All right. God uses unplanned diversions to line things up beyond our scope. Has anyone? Have you seen that?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely have in my life. I kind of tend to look at the circumstances and think that I know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But then it's usually hindsight when you look back and say, oh, I know why I was living there. I know why that was.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes the things that don't happen to us, well, the story in scripture that I use about this is actually Paul, when he was planning to go to Bithynia, and then he was stopped from going, and he ended up in Philippi, which is was this little city, and he ended up, he went there and he didn't know why he was there, and it was totally a diversion as far as he was concerned, and he ended up, there wasn't even a temple there because he was trying to spread the word about Jesus. And he gets there and there's just some women. So he starts preaching to some women, and one of the women ended up, she was pretty wealthy and influential, and she ended up believing. And so she opened her home, and that was where the Philippian church started. And then the way the Philippian church came together was just this random group of people that they met. One was a jailer when they were in jail, and you know, it was just this crazy group. And yet, if you look at the book of Philippians, it's one of everybody's favorite books in the Bible. It's so incredible. And those are all letters that Paul wrote to these groups of people, these churches. And the Philippian church ended up being like one of his dearest friends. If you look, you know, at some of the verses in Philippians. But what's really cool about that is even in Philippians 1, Paul's in prison when he's writing this letter. And because of his experience of this unplanned diversion starting the church, he says in his letter to the Philippians, you know, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has only served to advance the gospel. In other words, my imprisonment, I'm seeing that other people are out there preaching, and so I can see the good in where I am because of what he learned when he was there. And I think about that verse, and I'm like, he's saying what has happened to me has served to advance the gospel. And the only reason that Paul wrote letters is because he was in prison. And Paul's letters ended up being half of the New Testament. So the reach that he had by being in prison writing letters was so far beyond what he could have ever imagined. And so that diversion in his life ended up, you know, being in prison ended up reaching hundreds of thousands and billions of people all over the world throughout time. And he could never have seen that. He just responded to what was in front of him. But he knew, because of his experience, that God always has a purpose where you are. Even when you don't want to be there, he does. And you look back and you see what that purpose is. So, yeah.
So an unplanned diversion probably in my life, and I would say in our family's life, was of course my mom moving in with us. We didn't really plan that a lot far in advance. We just decided this is what we're going to do. And then to speak to the previous slide, which is, oh my gosh, how is this ever gonna, this is not easy. But what has happened now that she's been gone, it kind of lined up, I suddenly, what am I gonna do after that? And now I have all these people that I really enjoy working with, and it isn't like work for me, it's just like so that sort of lined up things for me. And then the families that just kind of seem to find, it's just, they all become like family to me, which is even stranger yet, but.
So I mean, even I was thinking through that experience of having your mom and how it led to your job that you wouldn't do, and how, I mean, it is weird to look back and connect the dots on things that you didn't really think had meaning. You just kind of are randomly going through and then you're going, oh my gosh, this is this, this is this. Like, for instance, you know, I told you that my engagement broke up. I was engaged for a year and a half. And my fiance had an 8-year-old daughter that I got really, really close to. And I was so bummed to lose her as much as I was to lose him. And yet now I look back and I see how my relationship with her prepared me for my relationship with my stepson now. Like, God was teaching me things during that time. Now, that's not what I knew at the time. I was just brokenhearted. Why is this happening? I don't understand. And I think what I try to do in this book is help you make those connections in your life. Things that you thought were random, or you didn't know what God was doing. And now all of a sudden you look back and you say, oh my goodness, because I don't think people reflect enough. And that's why we miss God. We don't know. We're not thinking on that level. So we just think, oh my gosh, where is God? What's going on? Everything's random chaos. But when you really stop to look, there's so many, you know, so much evidence of his work, I think. But you do have to look. So, okay, what's the next one? Okay, this is a good one. Sometimes the path for our future comes through saying yes to the need on our path. So, for instance, an opportunity comes up in front of you, and you have no idea that saying yes to that opportunity is going to lead to something unbelievable in your life. You don't see where it's going to lead to. You just see what the need is in front of you, and so you do that need. It's kind of what we were just saying. But and you know, I know for me, for instance, taking that job at the church, especially when I heard there were no single people there, I was like, well, I guess I'm not getting married, but at least I'll go and serve in this church. And it was saying yes to that job that actually opened up so much of my life and my family and everything that happened after that. So, anybody else resonate with this one? All right, that's the next one. Okay, so this is the last one, right? I think so. Anyway, your story is being formed not just for you, but for lives that will come after you. So this is the whole discussion about timing. So we live on this timeline. That's, you know, we're born at a certain time and we die at a certain time, and our life here is what it is. But if we believe that this life is only part of the story, that actually there's an eternal timeline, then we know, like, we're only spending part of our time here. And that actually, I guess for me, that gives me more courage and impetus to live whatever it is I'm here to live as best as I can. Because I know that this is the end of the story. I might not have everything resolved at the end of my story, but there's a plan for my life. And what this quote is about is that you know, your life is not just about you, but it's about the lives that will come after you. And you in your relationships right now, and in your circumstances, and everything that you're doing is going to impact people like a chain reaction, and it'll also impact people that are behind you, and you know, the children and the friends of children. And I think about in my own life, you know, coming together with my husband, and then our stepson, my stepson, his son, and he got, because I was working in that church that I went up to work at, he got raised in the church community and had a great youth pastor who he loved, and ended up when he was 17, right in the middle of COVID, deciding to get baptized. And you know, and so he did that, and then he ended up becoming part of our worship band, and he's a great guitar player and singer. And I, you know, now I'm thinking like the influence that he might have, you know, with the people that maybe I will never know, but all because we came together, because I was in this church community, and you know, God had this all planned. And so that's kind of, and I also think about like, okay, so then I write this book on step parenting that's helping step parents have courage to live their story well as a step parent, which is really hard. It's hard to be a step parent. And I've had so many conversations with step parents now that I never would have known had I not said yes to that job in Santa Barbara, that I ended up meeting Jerry and then coming together with Mike. And so I think that if we go, gosh, I'm here for more than just me, like, you know, my life is important because it's connected to other people. Does that make sense? And so to realize like my decisions matter because I'm gonna impact other people that come after me. And so that's kind of where this quote comes from. The last chapter in the book, I really dive into Hebrews 11, which is where that verse about faith comes from. Faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. And then it's kind of what they call the Hall of Fame of faith. It's kind of like you're going to the Academy Awards and here are the people that get like, and this person did this, and this person did this, and they were giants in the faith. But what's really weird about that chapter is you start off with like Abraham and Moses and all these great people of faith. But the chapter ends with all these people who are dying. Like, and then this person was, you know, a sword, you know, crucified upside down and killed, and you know, and it's just like, why is this the end of the chapter? Usually the end is like the great awards, right? But as I was thinking about it, you know, our death is our greatest act of faith. Our belief of what's going to happen to us after we die is our greatest act of faith. And I saw in my cousin, it's actually my cousin's husband, he was a firefighter for many, many years, and he retired early. He had a dream life, really. He and his wife had a dream life. And then he got diagnosed with cancer, and it was throat cancer, and he beat it, and it was hell for him because of treatment and what he had to go through, and he beat it. And he was cancer free for like a year and a half, and then all of a sudden the cancer came back and spread and went everywhere, and he still tried to beat it as hard as he could. And finally the doctor said, there's nothing more we can do for you. And to watch this man who was such an incredible firefighter, such a good guy, go through this. And then he gets this terrible, devastating news. And the weirdest thing happened, you guys. I mean, all of a sudden, it's like a switch went on and he realized where he's going. And he started witnessing to everybody in the hospital, like doctors and nurses were like, what is going on? This man that was skin and bones, he's like, I know where I'm going. I am going to Jesus, and I'm so lucky to be able to be leaving and going. It's you who I feel bad for, you know, and I mean, it was just this huge perspective shift. And the way he died was so beautiful in a way, because people who came to comfort him, he ended up comforting. It was such a weird thing to watch, but such an inspiring thing to watch. And I thought, I hope I go out that way. I've always thought about that. Like, how will you go out? When you go out, how will you go out? Because we don't get to choose when that happens, but I'll tell you, I have read the statistics and 10 out of 10 die. So we are going to die at some point, not to bring it down, but we don't know when that'll be. And I just, if we have confidence and know where we're going, then we can meet it with courage. And I think that's what Hebrews 11 is saying, that, you know, these people just met it with courage because they knew where they were going, so they could live their life fully, even the hard parts. And so that's kind of the last chapter. I'm just going to do one other thing and just see if I'm going to read the chapter titles because they're all kind of cool. And if you have any like, what's that about? You can go ahead and ask me and I can just comment on them, or if you have any question at all, and then we'll just wrap it up after that. So the first chapter is more is happening than you can see. Second chapter is time is never lost. The third is forcing your way, complicate your life. The fourth is your little leads to God's big. The fifth chapter is guidance comes from behind. The sixth chapter is holding on, maybe letting go. And the seventh is God is in the hard. And the eighth is when in doubt, look at Jesus. The ninth is find your compass in community. And the 10th chapter is your faith is part of a bigger story. Was there any chapter title that stood out, like as I was reading, like, I want to hear about that? Yes,
Time is never lost.
time is never lost. Yeah. How many of you feel like time is lost sometimes? Okay, most of us do, I think. Well, but when I started thinking about time, is time itself is never lost. The same amount of time is never lost, but we measure it differently depending on what's going on. Like you'll discover this as you get older, those of you who are younger here. Time can move so slow, and then all of a sudden as you get old, you just notice it's really going fast. Well, it's all the same amount of time, but it just feels differently. Or like if you're a parent, the days are so long raising kids, and then all of a sudden they're leaving your home and you're like, what happened? How did this happen so fast? And so it's kind of like we measure it depending on what's going on in the time, but time itself is always the same and it's never lost. But what is lost is what we wanted the time to be. So that's what makes us feel like time is lost. We just lost time because I wanted that time to be different. And what I talk about in that chapter is how there are seasons where, like for instance, in Moses' life, the chapter that I talk about is not when he led everybody out and parted the Red Sea, and not when he was rescued as a baby and was in the palace, but the 40 years in between when he was just shepherding them. And I know that Moses didn't know what was going to happen when he turned to 80, because that's how old he was when he got to the burning bush. And so in all those 40 years, he could have felt like time was totally lost. Just, what's going on? I guess this is it. This is it for me. I'm just going to be out here. But if you look back on that time, being that he was a shepherd in the wilderness, he was learning all the secrets of the wilderness. And God was teaching him that, because one day he'd be leading thousands of people through that same wilderness. He just didn't know it. So he was learning things he needed to know for the future. And another thing that happened is he met his father-in-law, Jethro, who was ended up being a very significant person in his life. And Moses never really had a dad because he was raised in Pharaoh's palace, and he was plucked out of the water because he was a Hebrew and everyone thought he was Egyptian. And so that God would bring him a dad, and who would end up being really, really significant later in his life and his leadership. And so you can look back on the time, that 40 years of nothing, there was a lot going on, but I don't think Moses knew that. I mean, I can imagine that he thought a lot of times, like, what's my life? It's not. So I think that, for me, looking back on, for instance, a long time of singleness, if I measured my life based on marriage, then I wasted half my life, more than half my life. I didn't get married to my late 40s. But instead, I kind of looked at it like, what did God want for that time? It wasn't what I wanted for that time, but I look back and I see so many things happen because I wasn't married that I got to do. And I, always wanted to be a mom. Well, being a mom, the only way I haven't been a mom is biologically, because I've been a mom every other way, because I was a youth pastor, and so I had lots of relationships with kids, especially the ones that didn't have great parents. And I was an inner city mentor, and that's a whole story that you'll hear if you come to any of my other talks. And all these people that needed a mom, and so the way I say it is, I'm praying, God, I want to be a mom, and I had in my mind a biological mom. And I think what God was saying is, if you're not hung up on the biology piece, I got a lot of kids who need a mom. So if that's really what you want, and you're willing to take it in a different package, then I've got, and so when we say time is lost, sometimes we have to look at what is this time for, and what is happening in me and around me to position me for what's going to happen in my life. So it's just kind of it's a cool chapter, because it really just talks about what we think about time, the same time, but we look at it so differently based on what's happening in that time. So any of the others that stood out?
What was
The one on community?
Yes, that's that one I talk about how your community makes such a difference in the way your faith will develop or not develop. And I take examples in the Bible, how like the community that Moses ended up leading out of, through the Red Sea, the Israelites, they were so happy to leave, they had been slaves. And then they started wandering around the wilderness, and then they were hungry, and then they were thirsty. And then instead of going, well, we just saw God part of Red Sea, so we know he's gonna supply food. No, they were like, oh no, nothing's gonna happen. Oh my gosh. And they just kept doing it again and again and again. And because they were just gripers and complainers, everybody became a griper and a complainer. And they had no faith for what was gonna happen. Even watching a whole sea part. It's like they couldn't remember. And so I kind of talk about how people around you can affect and impact the way you believe. And then I look at another community in Acts and how it was exactly the opposite. Like they experienced so much persecution, but they had such a strong faith, and they just urged each other on, we can do it, let's just pray. We know that God, so it was just like, you can watch this. And then I talk about something else that's kind of interesting. Another aspect of community is being willing to hear the truth from people. I think that sometimes we tell each other what we want to hear, and we don't tell each other what we need to hear. And part of that is because sometimes we don't want to hear. And so when you sense that somebody doesn't want to hear, then even if you think you might want to tell the truth to someone, if it's going to be hard, then you won't say it. And I use the example of Pontius Pilate and David. And Pontius Pilate was the one that ends up being known as the one that crucified Jesus. And it's so interesting because he does everything he can not to be that person. Like, hey, you guys want, he doesn't want the responsibility of doing it. He's like, and then Jesus himself is with Pilate and says, I am who you say I am. And he's like, yeah, but what about all these people? What they're saying, he could not stand up against the crowd. His wife sends him a message like, don't have anything to do with this man. There's something about him. I had a dream last night. He doesn't listen to that. And then the crowd, just wins him over. And ironically, Pontius Pilate is the only one named in the Apostles' Creed that everybody recites, like suffered under Pontius Pilate. So here he didn't want to be the one. Okay, it's the crowd's doing it. I'm washing my hands of this. I didn't do this. And he's the one that ends up because he didn't make a decision and didn't listen to people. And then you look at David, and David, as much as he blew it with Bathsheba, everybody knows that story. When Nathan the prophet came to him and told him a story, because what happened was that David ended up, while one of his own soldiers was away, he sees his wife, Bathsheba, and asks about her, finds out that she's married to one of his soldiers. And even though they say, well, isn't that, Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, he goes ahead and sends for her and sleeps with her. And then he finds out she's pregnant. So now he tries to get Uriah back to sleep with her so he can cover it up. And Uriah is too good of a guy and says, no, I can't have a night with my wife when my fellow soldiers are out there fighting. I can't do it. So he sleeps on the porch. And now David's stuck. And so he sets up the front, he doesn't kill Uriah, but he says, send Uriah to the front lines if Uriah is killed. And so it's all covered up. Nobody knows. And Nathan, the prophet, comes to him and says, I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a man who had a whole bunch of sheep, and another poor man who had one little lamb he loved. And the man who had all the sheep decided that he wanted that lamb from the other guy and took it. And David was like, that man must die, and Nathan goes, you are that man. And he, instead of going, get out of here, you don't tell me this, he said, you're right, I have sinned. And he listened to me, he listened to the truth. And so that's kind of what I talk about. Community is a place that should be a place of safety, a place of truth telling where we can all grow. And then just some other things I talk about. But I think the main point of that chapter is really that your community, and I think we all know this, that your community really has a big And so choose well, is what I said, choose well the community that you're gonna be in and your friends. Well, I think I've probably talked long enough. So I don't think I will show the trailer again, because it was a little, I like it, but it's moving and loud, and they can watch it on there. Actually, yeah, I developed a series that goes with the book on Right Now Media, and it just came out, so you can find that if you're listening online, you can find that at Right Now Media or on my website. And I'm gonna be premiering the trailer on my Instagram next week, and Right Now Media will be too, so you'll see more of that there, and I think probably better than we're watching here. But thanks so much for coming and being a part of this, and thanks you guys, and if you have any other questions, I'll be back to books. And you can, if you're online, you can find the book anywhere. Of course, Baker wants you to find it here. But you can, it's wherever books are sold, so thanks.